I discovered that for 8 years, my mother was receiving my disability pension of $400 monthly, but told the family I was a parasite who never helped with anything. The white envelope from Social Security fell on the worn wooden floor of my tiny wheelchair, accessible apartment with a thud that echoed like a cannon shot in my hypersensitive ears that suffocating Tuesday afternoon. When I finally discovered the devastating truth that my own mother had methodically constructed during 8 entire years, while I survived on $230 monthly, that she claimed was all the government granted me as disability assistance after the traffic accident that destroyed my spinal column and left me paraplegic at 31 years old when I was returning from work as a nurse in a public hospital, where I dedicated exhausting night shifts caring for terminal patients who saw me as a guardian angel, but who never suspected that a few months later, I myself would become completely dependent on others. Care to perform basic functions like bathing or preparing simple meals that required mobility. I lost definitively that rainy night, when a drunk driver ran a red light at a busy intersection and transformed my productive existence into a painful reality of permanent physical limitations, combined with constant social humiliation of being treated as a useless burden by my own family, who should have offered me minimum emotional support during the traumatic process of adapting to life in a wheelchair. My 39 years of life consciously lived on apparently solid foundations of family relationships, based on genuine maternal love and especially on the comforting certainty that my mother Vera was doing absolutely everything within her power to help me financially during the devastating period of impossible physical recovery and psychological adjustment to the permanent disability that robbed me of independence and dignity that I had built through an entire decade working honestly in the profession I chose out of true vocation to care for vulnerable people. Crumbled instantly and irreversibly when I read those official words printed on government letterhead, informing me that my monthly benefit for total and permanent disability was exactly $2,400 deposited religiously every 10th business day of each month, in a bank account I didn't even know existed because Vera had completely assumed administration of my finances, claiming that a person in my debilitated physical condition shouldn't worry about stressful bureaucratic matters that could hinder the already sufficiently difficult process of emotional recovery and adaptation to the new reality of absolute physical dependence on others for basic daily survival. The official Social Security notification wasn't routine correspondence about registration renewal or confirmation of updated personal data, according to standard administrative procedures that government agencies execute periodically, but rather a formal communication about irregularities detected in the address registered for sending monthly benefit statements, because apparently the mail carrier responsible for the route had repeatedly reported that that specific address in the official records didn't correspond to the actual residence of the beneficiary holder of the disability assistance, thus creating an urgent need for personal appearance at the nearest Social Security office, carrying updated documentation, proving current residence for registration regularization that would avoid temporary suspension of monthly payments until administrative inconsistencies were properly clarified and corrected according to regulatory norms established by specific federal legislation about assistance benefits, destined for people with permanent disability, proven through medical reports, issued by official examination of the National Social Security Institute. The address mentioned in that disturbing notification was exactly the address of the spacious house where Vera lived alone since my father died 12 years ago from cardiac complications that progressively deteriorated his health during the last decade of life, working as an independent merchant who sacrificed his own physical well-being to guarantee decent university education for me and for my older sister Claudia, who was always the favorite daughter receiving disproportionate maternal attention, and especially substantially greater financial resources during our entire shared childhood and youth in the same family home, where effective hierarchies were established silently through daily gestures that clearly communicated who deserved unconditional love and who should content themselves with emotional crumbs distributed occasionally when convenient to maintain appearances of a functional family before external observers who never suspected the toxic dynamics constantly operating behind the scenes of that apparently harmonious household. The physical sensation I experienced upon mentally processing the devastating implications of that absolutely shocking discovery was exactly like having my chest violently compressed by an industrial vice, tightening progressively until completely expelling all air from my lungs, leaving me suffocated and desperate trying to recover basic capacity to breathe adequately, while my rational mind frantically struggled to construct some alternative narrative that could explain that glaring inconsistency between the $230 that Vera handed me monthly in cash, claiming it was the total benefit amount after deducting mandatory administrative fees and maintenance costs of the bank account where supposedly the money was originally deposited, versus the $2,400 that the official document confirmed were deposited integrally every month in an account whose registered address was her residence, instead of my adapted dwelling located in a distant neighborhood where I lived socially isolated due to the toxic combination of severe physical limitations that hindered independent locomotion, and especially due to the paralyzing shame I constantly felt about being seen publicly as a disabled person, dependent on a wheelchair for basic mobility in a society that treats people with disabilities as second-class citizens deserving of condescending pity instead of genuine respect and meaningful social inclusion. During all those interminable 8 years since the traumatic accident that irreversibly transformed my previously productive and independent existence into a claustrophobic reality of absolute dependence and progressive social isolation, Vera had repeated tirelessly to all extended family, including my sister Claudia, my brother-in-law Fernando, various uncles, and especially to curious neighbors always eager for gossip about others' misfortunes, that I was an unsustainable financial burden, draining her limited resources through constant needs related to expensive medications, frequent specialized medical consultations, costly orthopedic equipment, and especially through my supposed stubborn refusal to contribute minimally to household expenses, despite receiving a modest but sufficient government benefit to at least cover part of the astronomical costs that my basic maintenance supposedly generated monthly for her budget, already compromised by the small pension of a municipal teacher who worked 3 decades educating children in precarious public schools located in violent peripheries. That carefully constructed narrative, repeated systematically during years by Vera, had created a widespread perception among all family members and acquaintances that I was essentially an ungrateful parasite, cynically taking advantage of her maternal kindness, who heroically sacrificed her own comfort and financial stability to support a disabled adult daughter, who could theoretically work remotely or seek professional alternatives compatible with physical limitations, but who comfortably preferred to live at the expense of an elderly mother, who deserved to finally enjoy a tranquil retirement after decades of hard work and countless sacrifices, raising alone 2 daughters after the premature death of her husband, who left substantial debts instead of a comfortable inheritance that could guarantee financial security for the widow and dependents. This distorted but widely accepted perception about my supposedly parasitic character and my null contribution to family dynamics had progressively created devastating social isolation, where relatives who previously maintained regular contact with me gradually began to avoid me, or treat me with growing coldness during rare occasions when we met at mandatory family gatherings like birthdays or important holidays, demonstrating through judgmental looks and veiled comments that they considered me a shameful burden, and especially a negative example of a person who allowed physical disability to completely define personal identity, instead of seeking inspirational overcoming that society constantly romanticizes through ableist narratives about exceptional disabled people who manage to transcend physical limitations through heroic willpower, ignoring completely material realities and systemic barriers that make full social participation practically impossible for the overwhelming majority of people living with severe disabilities in a country that offers minimal government support, and especially in a society that treats accessibility as an optional luxury instead of a fundamental human right, constitutionally guaranteed, but rarely effectively implemented in daily practice. I grabbed my old cell phone with a cracked screen that I had bought used 3 years ago when I managed to save enough money through entire months, religiously saving small amounts left over from the $230 monthly that Vera handed me after paying the tiny rent of the adapted apartment where I lived alone, since she decided 6 years ago that it would be better for both of us if I lived independently, instead of continuing to occupy a room in her spacious house that could be transformed into an office or sewing space where she would finally have privacy to develop relaxing hobbies deserved after decades caring for an ungrateful family that never adequately recognized the monumental sacrifices she had voluntarily made out of supposedly unconditional, but in reality, extremely conditional maternal love distributed unequally between daughters based on mysterious criteria that were never openly explained, but that unequivocally communicated through daily actions who deserved genuine devotion and who should content themselves with family obligations minimally fulfilled to maintain socially acceptable appearances. I dialed with trembling fingers that physically demonstrated the devastating emotional turbulence processing internally, the Social Security office number clearly printed at the bottom of the official notification. Waiting anxiously during 18 interminable minutes, hearing generic electronic music intercalated with recorded messages informing about the importance of the call and requesting patience while attendants remained busy processing urgent demands from other beneficiaries similarly. Facing complicated bureaucratic situations threatening to suspend essential benefits on which they depended completely for basic monthly survival, in a country where the social safety net is chronically underfunded and systematically sabotaged by successive governments prioritizing economic interests of elites instead of the welfare of vulnerable populations dependent on government assistance to maintain minimum dignity compatible with decent human life. Finally, I was connected with an employee who formally identified herself as a social worker, responsible for serving beneficiaries of disability assistance who needed clarifications about administrative procedures or who faced technical difficulties related to payments, registrations, or periodic renewals of medical reports, proving permanence of incapacitating conditions, justifying continuity of monthly benefits according to specific legislation, regulating concession of assistance benefits destined for people with disability proven through official medical evaluations performed by accredited experts institutionally linked to the federal Social Security system. Her voice had that neutral but not necessarily cold professional quality characteristic of public servants who develop psychological mechanisms of emotional distancing to deal daily with hundreds of cases involving genuine human suffering and extreme vulnerability without completely succumbing to the compassion fatigue that inevitably affects professionals constantly working at the interface between impersonal government bureaucracy and desperate human needs of marginalized populations, struggling to access basic rights theoretically guaranteed by law but frequently denied in practice through bureaucratic obstacles intentionally created to discourage legitimate requests and reduce fiscal costs of social programs that conservative politicians consider excessive spending, instead of necessary investments in social justice and minimum redistribution of resources that could alleviate obscene inequalities characterizing contemporary Brazilian society, profoundly stratified by class, race, and especially by physical capacity, that determines who deserves full participation in community life, and who must remain socially invisible, confined in private spaces far from public gazes, uncomfortable with the presence of bodies that challenge ableist norms about ideal human functionality. When I briefly explained the situation about the notification received requesting registration regularization due to inconsistencies in the officially registered address for sending monthly benefit statements, I perceived a subtle change in the employee's tone of voice suggesting she had immediately recognized a familiar pattern of similar situations she probably processed regularly involving family members administering benefits of disabled relatives without necessarily fully passing on owed amounts or adequately informing titular beneficiaries about legal rights and administrative procedures that should be transparent but are frequently intentionally obscured by financial guardians exploiting vulnerability and dependence of disabled people, naively trusting family members who should protect their interests but occasionally prioritize their own benefit over the welfare of vulnerable dependents. The social worker informed me with a mixture of compassionate professionalism and necessary frankness that official records of the Social Security integrated system clearly indicated that my monthly benefit of $2,400 was deposited integrally every 10th business day in a bank account registered in my name, but whose corresponding address for sending bank correspondence was registered as being a different residence from the one where I confirmed I was currently living, thus creating an administrative discrepancy that needed to be investigated immediately to determine if there were potential irregularities involving diversion of resources legally destined to me as the titular beneficiary of assistance for permanent disability proven through official medical reports permanently archived in the federal Social Security system. Each word pronounced by the social worker was like an additional hammer blow, progressively breaking comforting illusions I had maintained during 8 entire years about Vera being essentially a good person facing genuine financial difficulties, aggravated by the need to support me, as a disabled daughter incapable of adequately contributing to household expenses due to severe limitations imposed by permanent paraplegia, resulting from a traumatic accident that no one could have foreseen or avoided through reasonable precautions. The employee patiently explained that I had absolute legal right to immediately request complete transfer of administration of the bank account where the benefit was deposited monthly, Changing the registered address to my current residence, and especially obtaining direct access to bank cards and passwords that would allow me to independently control financial resources legally destined to me, without need for intermediation by third parties who theoretically should be acting in my best interest, but who apparently were retaining a substantial portion of monthly amounts for reasons that remained obscure, but certainly weren't compatible with ethical and legal obligations of financial representatives, administering resources of vulnerable people dependent on government assistance for decent basic survival. She specifically oriented me about necessary procedures to personally appear at the nearest Social Security office, carrying updated personal documentation, including recent proof of residence, medical reports confirming permanent disability condition, and especially a written declaration formally requesting administrative investigation about possible irregularities in benefit administration during the specific period I wished to officially question through a process that could result in recovery of improperly retained amounts, and especially an eventual legal accountability of people who had diverted resources legally destined to the titular beneficiary of assistance, constitutionally protected as a fundamental right of a person with medically proven permanent disability. When I hung up the cell phone after meticulously noting all information and guidance provided by the social worker, who demonstrated genuine compassion, mixed with contained professional indignation about yet another apparent case of financial exploitation of a disabled person by a supposedly caring family member, I felt as if I were slowly waking from a prolonged coma during which I had passively lived in an alternative reality, meticulously constructed by Vera through systematic lies repeated tirelessly during years until they became unquestionable truths blindly accepted by me and by everyone around us who never thought to independently verify narratives presented by a respectable elderly woman whose social reputation as a dedicated mother and conscientious retired teacher conferred automatic credibility to any story she chose to tell about private family circumstances that external witnesses could never directly verify without seeming intrusive or disrespectful. Questioning the word of an elderly lady who had supposedly sacrificed entire decades, raising alone 2 daughters after being prematurely widowed, becoming solely responsible for financial and emotional maintenance of a family. To be born, but who are constantly held responsible for supposed sacrifices that parents voluntarily choose to make as part of fundamental responsibilities they consciously assume when deciding to bring new, vulnerable human beings into the precarious existence characterizing contemporary reality. That depended completely on her for basic stability, necessary during formative periods of child and adolescent development that permanently shape adult personalities and especially emotional capacities to establish healthy relationships based on mutual trust instead of systematic manipulation, disguised as maternal love, that demands eternal gratitude and unquestioning obedience as payment for basic care that should be offered unconditionally to children who never asked. The first instinctive reaction after minimally processing the devastating implications of that discovery was to immediately confront Vera, demanding explanations about the glaring discrepancy between amounts she claimed was the total benefit versus the actual sum deposited monthly during 8 entire years while I survived on miserable resources that barely covered basic rent and precarious food, leaving zero margin for additional expenses, like essential medications I frequently needed to choose not to buy due to absolute lack of sufficient financial resources, or like specialized medical consultations with professionals who could significantly improve quality of life, but that cost amounts impossible to pay with $230 monthly, after deducting mandatory expenses related to housing and minimum food necessary to not literally starve to death in a tiny apartment, socially isolated from any community support network that could offer material or emotional assistance during crisis moments when scarce resources were completely exhausted. Before month's end, leaving me occasionally dependent on charity from neighbors who pityingly witnessed my extreme vulnerability, but who rarely offered substantial help, preferring to maintain comfortable distance from poverty, that made them feel uncomfortable about their own economic precariousness, disguised through appearances of middle-class stability that could instantly collapse facing unexpected financial emergencies like unemployment or serious illnesses that rapidly transform formal workers into vulnerable populations, dependent on chronically inadequate assistance networks for real needs of people simultaneously facing multiple vulnerabilities that mutually reinforce, creating vicious cycles of poverty and social exclusion, practically impossible to break individually without significant institutional support. But before my instinctive impulse of immediate confrontation could transform into concrete action, involving taking public transportation to Vera's house, located at the other extreme of the city, crossing miles of distance separating my modest adapted apartment from the middle class residential neighborhood where she maintains that spacious house inherited from my deceased father 12 years ago. I finally managed to recover a minimum fragment of rationality, sufficient to recognize that direct emotional confrontation without adequate strategic preparation would probably result in vehement denial, accompanied by elaborate explanations that Vera had certainly meticulously prepared. During 8 entire years, anticipating the remote possibility of accidental discovery about the financial scheme operating systematically transforming government benefit legally destined to me into her personal resources through methodically planned diversion demonstrating disturbing sophistication, considering the supposed simplicity of a retired municipal teacher whose public image projected unshakable honesty and especially unquestionable morality that would never permit conscious participation in financial fraud directed against her own disabled daughter, living in situation of extreme vulnerability, depending completely on those scarce resources for basic monthly survival. The urgent need to adequately document the entire situation before any direct confrontation that could alert Vera about the discovery and potentially motivate her to destroy compromising evidence or fabricate even more elaborate alternative narratives became an absolute priority that needed to be executed methodically through careful procedures involving consultation with competent authorities. Obtaining official banking and Social Security records, an especially comprehensive legal preparation that would protect me against reverse accusations that manipulative people frequently employ when confronted about fraudulent behaviors, suddenly transforming themselves into victims unjustly persecuted by ungrateful daughters who supposedly don't recognize monumental parental sacrifices. I spent the following 4 hours after that revealing call with the Social Security social worker, sitting immobile in the wheelchair positioned near the narrow window of the tiny apartment that offered a depressing view of a shared internal courtyard surrounded by deteriorated residential buildings where neighbors occasionally circulated, executing routine domestic tasks, completely oblivious to the fact that they were involuntarily witnessing through unintentionally transparent windows the silent psychological collapse of a paraplegic woman processing devastating discovery about systematic maternal betrayal operating secretly during years, transforming an apparently functional family relationship into an elaborate farce sustained through meticulously constructed lies repeated tirelessly until they acquired the appearance of unquestionable truths blindly accepted by everyone involved, except obviously by the criminal architect of these calculated fabrications. My mind alternated obsessively between trying to construct rational narratives that could benignly explain the astronomical discrepancy between declared amounts versus actual sums without necessarily attributing deliberate malice to Vera, and progressively accepting the inescapable reality that that situation didn't admit innocent interpretations or accidental explanations, considering the prolonged magnitude of the financial diversion that had operated consistently month after month during 8 entire years, totaling approximately $200,000 systematically subtracted from the benefit legally destined to me, while Vera simultaneously constructed an elaborate public narrative characterizing me as a financial parasite, draining her limited resources through supposedly insatiable needs related to physical disability. She claimed to be heroically sustaining, despite growing economic difficulties threatening her stability as an elderly retiree living alone, on modest fixed income insufficient to cover both her own expenses and astronomical costs of maintaining a disabled adult daughter who stubbornly refused to seek financial independence through remote work or other professional alternatives compatible with physical limitations. The only specific memory that repeatedly emerged during that obsessive process of historical review was a vague recollection of a relatively serious discussion we had approximately 1 year before the traumatic accident that resulted in my permanent paraplegia, when I had announced my decision to definitely move from the family home to my own rented apartment with financial resources. I had managed to save working years as a nurse in a public hospital where modest but stable salaries permitted some degree of financial independence sufficient to establish separate residence away from constant maternal supervision that was beginning to progressively suffocate me as I aged and naturally developed growing needs for personal autonomy and privacy that any reasonably functional adult aspires to eventually achieve through geographical separation from original family nucleus. Vera had reacted negatively to that announcement with disproportionate emotional intensity that surprised me at the time, considering I was already 29 years old and therefore well within socially acceptable age to establish independent residence, arguing vehemently that my move constituted flagrant ingratitude. After decades of sacrifices she claimed to have made, raising alone 2 daughters after my father's premature death when I was 17, and my sister Claudia 21, although honestly Dad had left a paid off house and some modest savings that guaranteed basic financial stability during subsequent years to his death, contradicting the narrative of financially helpless widowhood that Vera frequently employed when she wanted to evoke sympathy or justify controlling behaviors disguised as necessary. Maternal protection facing supposed extreme economic difficulties, constantly threatening family well-being. On that occasion, approximately 9 years ago, when I announced my intention to move to independent residence, Vera had employed multiple manipulative strategies trying to dissuade me, including allegations about her fragile health that required constant presence of a close family member in case medical emergencies occurred unexpectedly during solitary nights when an elderly person living alone could suffer falls or other domestic accidents without having anyone to request immediate assistance, followed by veiled insinuations about my supposed incapacity to adequately manage personal finances or maintain appropriate standards of domestic cleanliness without maternal supervision, guaranteeing I wouldn't neglect basic responsibilities of self-care and appropriate residential maintenance, and culminating finally in direct emotional appeals about the devastating loneliness she would experience living alone in that house too large for one person, after decades sharing domestic space with daughters, who now apparently didn't value the monumental sacrifices she claimed to have voluntarily made out of supposedly unconditional, but in reality always seemed extremely conditional, maternal love, distributed unequally between me and Claudia, based on mysterious criteria, never openly explained. Eventually, I managed to execute the planned move despite substantial emotional resistance from Vera, who never really graciously accepted my growing independence, maintaining during following years a pattern of subtly critical comments about my life choices, and especially about my supposed neglect of filial obligations that should include frequent visits, regular domestic assistance, and especially constant availability to attend her emotional needs whenever she decided she required reverse maternal care, where adult daughter assumed caregiver role responsible for psychological well-being of elderly mother, traversing chronic loneliness of prolonged widowhood. That recollection about Vera's intense resistance to my residential independence assumed now potentially sinister significance, considering current revelation about the financial scheme operating during the last 8 years. Would it be possible that my move to my own apartment years before the accident had created profound resentment that subsequently motivated elaboration of elaborate revenge, executed opportunistically after paraplegia made me vulnerable and dependent again on family assistance for navigation of complex bureaucratic systems related to Social Security benefits destined for people with disabilities? Alternatively, had the traumatic accident that destroyed my spinal column created a convenient opportunity for Vera to finally exercise total control over my life through administration of essential financial resources, realizing a fantasy of perpetual filial dependence that my previous independence had temporarily frustrated until cruel fate intervened through a drunk driver crossing a red light and transforming my productive existence into a reality of permanent physical limitations that reluctantly forced me to return to some degree of dependence on family support I had worked years to escape? These speculations about possible psychological motivations remained fundamentally unverifiable without direct access to Vera's internal mental processes, but offered at least conceptual frameworks through which I could try to comprehend the apparently incomprehensible behavior of a mother, systematically and deliberately harming the financial and emotional well-being of her own daughter during a prolonged period characterized by that daughter's extreme vulnerability, desperately needing exactly the type of genuine family support that should be offered unconditionally, but that apparently was replaced by opportunistic exploitation disguised as generous assistance deserving eternal gratitude and unquestioning obedience. The existence of a public defender's office offering free legal assistance to low-income populations constituted a potentially valuable resource. I had known theoretically through previous work as a nurse in a public hospital, where I occasionally witnessed vulnerable patients being oriented about legal rights and assistance services available free through government institutions, destined specifically to guarantee minimally equitable access to justice, regardless of individual financial capacity. But honestly had never imagined I myself would eventually need to resort to those services facing a complex legal situation, involving crimes committed by a member of my own family, systematically exploiting vulnerability resulting from permanent physical disability, that placed me precisely in the category of citizens that legislation recognizes as deserving special protection against financial exploitation and abuse by people occupying positions of trust or authority over critical aspects of their daily lives. The prospect of seeking assistance at the public defender's office brought a complex mixture of relief about existence of an institutional resource available free versus internalized shame about needing government charity, resulting precisely from a situation of artificial poverty deliberately created through criminal diversion of resources that should have guaranteed modest but sufficient financial stability during years since the traumatic accident, demonstrating how victims of financial crimes frequently experience double victimization, where initial material damage is compounded by social humiliation and irrational self-blame about vulnerability that permitted opportunistic exploitation to occur, despite criminal responsibility, obviously and entirely resting on the perpetrator who made conscious choices to violate trust and exploit a dependent person for illicit personal enrichment. The Tuesday afternoon when I received the disturbing Social Security notification transformed into a sleepless night where I remained awake lying in the narrow bed of the tiny apartment, observing shadows projected by public lighting, filtering through the thin curtain covering the small window, my mind obsessively processing the devastating implications of that discovery that had fundamentally transformed my understanding about recent family history, and especially about the character of a person I had blindly trusted during 8 entire years to administer critical aspects of my financial survival basing, that trust on naive presumption that maternally biological bonds would naturally guarantee prioritization of my well-being above her personal interests, especially considering extreme vulnerability resulting from permanent paraplegia, severely limiting my capacity to work or generate independent income sufficient to maintain basic standards of dignified living without assistance from government benefits destined specifically to people with medically proven disability through official evaluations performed by accredited experts, institutionally linked to the federal Social Security system, responsible for administering constitutionally protected assistance programs as fundamental rights of Brazilian citizens facing situations of social vulnerability resulting from permanent incapacitating conditions acquired through traumatic accidents, degenerative diseases, or congenital disabilities preventing full participation in formal labor market characterized by physical and temporal demands incompatible with functional limitations imposed by various types of physical, sensory, cognitive, or psychosocial disability legally recognized as legitimate justifications for concession of government financial support, destined to guarantee decent basic survival, and especially minimum social inclusion of historically marginalized populations systematically excluded from economic opportunities and full community participation. When I finally managed to sleep superficially during the first hours of dawn following that devastating discovery, disturbing dreams populated agitated sleep involving surreal scenarios where I confronted Vera demanding explanations about financial diversion, only to have her vehemently denying any irregularity. Claiming I was confused or delusional due to psychiatric medications she falsely invented I was taking to treat supposedly severe depression resulting from social isolation and especially from chronic loneliness, that my physical disability had created, transforming me into an emotional burden she heroically carried, despite her own difficulties. Facing solitary aging without adequate family support from daughters, she claimed had emotionally abandoned her after receiving university education and financial independence made possible through that traditional Brazilian culture still attributes predominantly to paternal figures, while relegating mothers to roles of emotional care and domestic maintenance, rarely adequately recognized or valued through monumental sacrifices she had voluntarily made during decades raising alone 2 children after premature death of husband, who left overwhelming responsibilities for unprepared widow, to face challenges of solitary motherhood in patriarchal society, offering minimal support to women, raising children without male partners, providing economic stability and especially disciplinary authority, financial compensation or deserved social recognition for essential reproductive work, sustaining foundations of functional society but systematically invisibilized and devalued by economic systems, exclusively prioritizing productive work performed in formal public spaces instead of recognizing equally essential contributions of domestic work and family care, executed predominantly by women without adequate remuneration or basic labor protections, guaranteed to formal workers employed in conventionally recognized economic sectors as productive despite total dependence of those sectors on invisibilized reproductive work, sustaining the very possibility of healthy and functional workforce capable of participating in formal economy. The recurrent nightmares of that sleepless night also included distressing variations where Vera managed to convince authorities that I was the one committing fraud, falsely claiming to have non-existent or exaggerated physical disability to obtain undue government benefits, supposedly presenting fabricated evidence demonstrating I was perfectly capable of walking and working normally, but chose to feign paraplegia to avoid responsibilities of regular employment and live comfortably at the expense of assistance programs legitimately destined for people with genuine severe disabilities preventing participation in competitive labor market, thus creating Kafkaesque scenarios where the real victim of systematic fraud was transformed through skillful narrative manipulation into a criminal perpetrator, while the real criminal assumed the role of victim unjustly accused by an ungrateful daughter who allegedly invented malicious accusations to avoid assuming her own financial responsibilities and especially to justify prolonged parasitic dependence on an elderly mother who deserved to finally enjoy tranquil retirement after decades of hard work and countless sacrifices that supposedly were never adequately recognized or appreciated by direct beneficiaries of those heroic maternal efforts voluntarily executed out of unconditional love that daughters apparently didn't reciprocate through perpetual gratitude and filial obedience that traditional Brazilian culture still prescribes as fundamental moral obligations of adult children toward aging parents who presumably deserve reverse care and especially unquestioning respect, regardless of actual quality of parental relationships. During childhood or of specific behaviors, parents may have demonstrated throughout decades of family coexistence, frequently characterized by toxic dynamics, culturally normalized through romantic idealizations about nuclear family as sacred institution immune to criticism even when concrete family relations involve systematic abuse, psychological manipulation, or economic exploitation of vulnerable members by authoritarian figures exercising disproportionate power through control over essential material resources and especially through manipulation of emotional bonds and cultural obligations, rigidly prescribed by traditional social norms, resistant to critical questioning about actual functionality, and especially about human costs of familist ideologies, prioritizing preservation of family unity above individual well-being of specific members, especially when those members occupy subordinate positions in power hierarchies determined by age, gender, or physical capacity, defining who deserves autonomy versus who must remain dependent and obedient to self-proclaimed family authorities. When the cell phone alarm finally sounded at 6 o'clock Wednesday morning following that torturous night of insomnia and distressing nightmares, I woke feeling an oppressive physical weight on my chest, as if a concrete mass were progressively compressing my ribs, preventing adequate breathing. A somatic manifestation of devastating psychological anxiety, processing trauma of discovering systematic maternal betrayal that had operated secretly during 8 entire years while I naively trusted in fabricated narratives about her financial difficulties, and especially about my supposed inadequate contribution to family dynamics, despite receiving a government benefit. She claimed was modest but sufficient to cover at least a portion of costs that my dependent existence supposedly generated monthly for her budget, already compromised by the small pension of a municipal teacher who worked decades educating children in precarious public schools without receiving adequate remuneration or deserved social recognition for essential work, but systematically devalued by a society that rhetorically glorifies educators, while simultaneously remunerating them miserably and subjecting them to degrading labor conditions characterized by overcrowded classrooms, chronic lack of basic pedagogical resources, and especially absence of institutional support to deal with complex challenges of educating student populations facing multiple social vulnerabilities resulting from poverty, community violence, fragmented family structures, and especially systemic inequalities, reproducing themselves intergenerationally through educational systems that theoretically should promote social mobility, but practically function as stratification mechanisms, consolidating privileges of dominant classes while offering only illusion of opportunity to marginalized populations condemned to remain in subordinate positions, serving interests of economic elites who depend on exploitation of cheap labor, and especially on maintenance of populations sufficiently educated to be productive, but not sufficiently critical to question foundations of a profoundly unjust social order, disproportionately benefiting privileged minorities at the expense of systematically exploited majorities through multiple mechanisms of value extraction, and especially suppression of critical consciousness that could motivate resistance. The decision to personally appear at the public defender's office that Wednesday morning required mobilization of emotional and physical resources I barely knew I possessed after a sleepless night processing devastating discovery about systematic maternal betrayal. But the urgency of adequately documenting the situation before Vera could be alerted about an ongoing investigation motivated me to overcome paralyzing exhaustion and especially severe social anxiety. That prolonged isolation had progressively intensified, making each public interaction a source of disproportionate stress that a person without lived experience of physical disability can hardly genuinely comprehend. The public transportation journey to the government building where the defender's office functioned transformed into a distressing ordeal, involving negotiation of inaccessible buses with steps too high for a wheelchair, obliging me to depend on occasional kindness of drivers willing to manually assist the humiliating process of being literally carried into the vehicle, while passengers observed with a mixture of condescending pity and poorly disguised irritation about delays caused, to manually assist the humiliating process of being literally carried into the vehicle, while passengers observed with a mixture of populations with reduced mobility who constitute a substantial percentage of citizens equally deserving access to public spaces and essential services constitutionally guaranteed but practically denied through architectural barriers intentionally maintained despite federal legislation requiring universal accessibility for decades, of condescending pity and poorly disguised irritation about delays caused by special needs of a disabled person, disrupting efficiency of a transportation system designed exclusively for normative bodies capable of climbing steps independently without external assistance that ableist society considers inconvenient, instead of recognizing as structural failure of systematically exclusionary urban planning. Dr. Patricia took meticulous notes on a tablet while I spoke, occasionally interjecting with specific questions destined to clarify crucial details about benefit administration, including whether Vera had formally obtained legal power of attorney authorizing control over my finances, or if she had simply assumed administration informally based on trust. I deposited in her, naively presuming that a mother would naturally prioritize my well-being above her personal interests, especially considering extreme vulnerability resulting from permanent paraplegia, severely limiting capacities of self-care, and especially defense against opportunistic exploitation by ill-intentioned people taking advantage of physical and emotional dependence of victims who blindly trust family members, occupying positions of authority over critical aspects of daily survival. When I confirmed I had never consciously signed any power of attorney or formal authorization permitting Vera to administer Social Security benefit, the attorney's expression noticeably hardened, suggesting the situation was potentially more serious than simple family financial mismanagement, probably involving multiple federal crimes related to falsification of public documents, misappropriation of government resources destined for a person with disability, systematic Social Security fraud executed during a prolonged period, and especially financial abuse of a vulnerable person that Brazilian legislation recognizes as substantial aggravating factor, increasing severity of applicable penalties when property crimes are committed specifically against elderly people, children, or people with disabilities who face additional barriers to adequately defending themselves against criminal exploitation by individuals violating trust deposited in family relationships that society erroneously presumes are always characterized by unconditional love, and especially by prioritization of vulnerable members' well-being above selfish interests of people occupying dominant positions in family hierarchies structured through power dynamics determined by physical capacity, economic resources, and especially by control over critical information and essential material resources. The legal strategy Dr. Patricia outlined involved multiple simultaneous fronts, beginning immediately with formal request to Social Security for complete transfer of administration of the bank account, where benefit was deposited monthly, including issuance of new bank cards and passwords exclusively for me, eliminating any access Vera might have maintained through fraudulent mechanisms, followed by official requisition of detailed bank statements covering the complete 8-year period, since beginning of benefit payments, documenting exactly how resources were moved and especially where they were transferred, in case Vera had systematically diverted funds to her personal accounts or to investments exclusively benefiting her financial interests instead of being applied according to legal destination to cover my basic needs related to housing, food, medications, specialized medical care, and especially adaptive equipment that could have substantially improved quality of life, but that remained inaccessible due to artificial scarcity of resources, deliberately created through criminal retention of amounts that should have been integrally available for use according to specific needs of titular beneficiary of constitutionally protected assistance as fundamental right. Additionally, Dr. Patricia explained the need to gather witnesses who could confirm the public narrative Vera had constructed, characterizing me as a financial parasite draining her limited resources, because that systematic defamatory campaign constituted crucial evidence demonstrating not only opportunistic financial fraud, but especially calculated psychological abuse destined to socially isolate me from potential support systems that could have eventually discovered the truth about the criminal scheme operating secretly, while the victim remained completely unconscious about the actual extent of systematic exploitation occurring through a person who should protect her interests but who consciously chose to violate the most fundamental trust that vulnerable human beings deposit in family caregivers, erroneously presuming that biology naturally guarantees ethical behavior that reality frequently dramatically contradicts. When I left the public defender's office building approximately 3 hours after arriving carrying official documentation, formally initiating the administrative investigation process and preparation of eventual criminal action against Vera, depending on results of preliminary inquiry about specific mechanisms through which she had managed to assume control over Social Security benefit, I felt simultaneously relief about finally taking concrete measures to recover financial autonomy and dignity, systematically stolen during 8 years, versus paralyzing terror about the inevitable confrontation that would occur when Vera was officially notified about an ongoing investigation questioning benefit administration, and especially when she discovered I had sought specialized legal assistance, challenging maternal authority, she presumed to be unquestionable based on traditional familist ideologies, prescribing perpetual filial obedience regardless of specific behaviors parents demonstrate throughout family relationships, frequently characterized by toxic dynamics, culturally normalized through romanticizations about supposedly unconditional maternal love that reality regularly contradicts through countless cases of parental abuse. Executed by people society automatically presumes to be natural protectors of children and vulnerable dependents, when empirical evidence repeatedly demonstrates that family relationships can be particularly dangerous contexts for exploitation and violence precisely. Because domestic isolation and especially cultural expectations about family privacy create ideal conditions for perpetrators to operate with impunity, exploiting vulnerability of victims who lack material or emotional resources to escape or report systematic abuses occurring secretly in the backstage of apparently functional but fundamentally toxic homes. The decision about when and how to inform my sister Claudia about the devastating discovery constituted an additional dilemma, complicating an already sufficiently complex situation, considering that the relationship between us had always been distant, characterized by silent competition for maternal attention, unequally distributed, consistently favoring her through daily gestures that unequivocally communicated effective hierarchies, established since childhood when treatment differences were attributed by me immaturely to natural preferences. Parents supposedly develop based on temperamental affinities with specific children, instead of recognizing deliberate patterns of favoritism that psychological research demonstrates are surprisingly common in families where parents project personal expectations and frustrations onto children, transforming innocent children into receptacles of unrealized ambitions or convenient scapegoats for dissatisfactions that adults should process through healthy mechanisms instead of destructively unloading onto vulnerable dependents incapable of adequately defending themselves against systematic emotional abuse disguised as necessary discipline or tough love that traditionalist Brazilian culture still mistakenly celebrates as parental virtue instead of recognizing as a form of psychological violence, causing profound developmental damage persisting throughout adult life through dysfunctional relationship patterns, chronic low self-esteem, and especially difficulties establishing trust in others due to traumas of having parental figures who should offer fundamental emotional security, repeatedly violating that basic trust through unpredictable behaviors alternating between conditional affection and punitive rejection based on arbitrary criteria, never adequately explained, leaving children constantly anxious, trying to decipher invisible rules governing distribution of parental love that should be unconditional, but frequently operates as a system of rewards and punishments, shaping child behaviors through emotional manipulation that therapists recognize as a form of psychological abuse, even when executed by well-intentioned parents unconsciously replicating dysfunctional patterns they themselves experienced during traumatic childhoods, thus perpetuating intergenerational cycles of emotional damage transmitted through families over decades without adequate therapeutic intervention that could break destructive patterns, allowing adults to process traumas and develop capacities for healthy parenting based on genuine empathy, and especially on respect for children's autonomy and dignity as complete individuals deserving unconditional love, instead of being treated as parents' property or personal projects through which adults try to vicariously achieve accomplishments they failed to achieve independently due to structural circumstances that limited opportunities, or due to personal choices they prefer not to recognize as own responsibility, preferring to blame children for supposedly not appreciating sacrifices parents claim to have voluntarily made, but frequently deeply resent, transforming parenting into source of bitterness, instead of source of genuine satisfaction that should characterize functional family relationships based on healthy emotional reciprocity, and especially on honest communication about needs and mutually respected boundaries. Finally, I gathered courage to telephone Claudia that same Wednesday afternoon, after returning exhausted from the public defender's office building, feeling urgent need to share the devastating discovery with the only family member who could potentially offer some emotional support, or at least validation about the seriousness of maternal betrayal that had operated secretly during 8 years systematically, exploiting my vulnerability while constructing a defamatory public narrative, characterizing me as a financial parasite, cynically taking advantage of her kindness, when reality was exactly opposite, demonstrating levels of calculated cruelty that transcended simple financial opportunism, entering territory of psychological sadism, deliberately executed to maximize suffering of a victim already facing extreme vulnerability, resulting from permanent paraplegia, destroying capacities of physical and financial independence laboriously conquered through an entire decade working honestly as a dedicated nurse, compassionately caring for terminal patients without ever imagining that a few years later I myself would become completely dependent on exactly the type of care I used to offer professionally. Demonstrating cruel irony of fate, transforming caregiver into person needing care. Through traumatic accident no one could have foreseen, but that Vera apparently decided to opportunistically exploit, instead of responding with genuine compassion that the desperate situation obviously required from any minimally decent person, especially from a mother who theoretically should naturally prioritize well-being of disabled daughter above any personal interest. Claudia answered the phone after 4 rings with a tone of voice carrying poorly disguised irritation, suggesting the call interrupted an important activity whose valuable time shouldn't be wasted with trivial demands from a problematic sister she apparently saw primarily as source of family embarrassment and emotional burden that Vera heroically bore, deserving admiration instead of criticism for extraordinary maternal dedication, caring for a disabled adult daughter who supposedly refused to assume basic self-care responsibilities, and especially to seek financial independence through remote work or other professional alternatives compatible with physical limitations that shouldn't necessarily completely prevent participation in labor market, according to ableist narratives that society constantly promotes about exceptional disabled people who manage to overcome obstacles through heroic determination, ignoring completely systemic barriers, and especially material realities that make employability practically impossible for majority of people living with severe disabilities in an economy offering minimal protections, and especially in a society treating disabled people as second-class citizens deserving condescending pity instead of genuine respect, and especially universal accessibility that would permit full participation in community life if urban infrastructure and institutional practices were designed inclusively from the beginning instead of retrofitting minimal accessibility as reluctant concession after political pressure from disability rights movements, fighting decades for basic rights theoretically guaranteed by federal legislation but rarely effectively implemented in daily practice. When I briefly explained to Claudia about the disturbing discovery related to Social Security benefit being systematically diverted by Vera during 8 years, while she constructed a public narrative characterizing me as a financial parasite, there was prolonged silence on the other end of the phone line, eventually followed by a response combining defensive skepticism with implicit accusation, suggesting I was probably confused or exaggerating the situation due to victimization tendencies. She claimed I consistently demonstrated blaming others for problems fundamentally resulting from my personal choices or stubborn refusal to accept appropriate adult responsibilities, including especially responsibility not to overburden family with constant needs related to physical disability, that although undeniably real, didn't completely justify prolonged dependence on family support when government and institutional resources were theoretically available for people with disabilities who were willing to navigate necessary bureaucracies instead of passively waiting for family members to solve all administrative problems, while simultaneously complaining about supposed lack of autonomy, fundamentally self-imposed through learned helplessness, that psychologists identify as common behavioral pattern among people who internalize narratives of incapacity instead of developing adaptive strategies that would permit maximum functional independence within real limitations imposed by specific disability conditions. Claudia's response painfully confirmed she had completely absorbed the narrative fabricated by Vera, genuinely believing I was a family problem, instead of recognizing I was a victim of systematic exploitation, executed by the very mother both of us naively presumed to be incapable of. Calculated cruelty that recent discovery indubitably revealed through documentary evidence that Claudia apparently refused to even objectively consider, preferring to maintain comforting illusions. About maternal integrity, that honest questioning would irreversibly destroy, forcing her to confront the disturbing possibility that the woman who raised both of us could be fundamentally different from the idealized image we had collectively constructed through decades of family conditioning and especially through cultural pressures to unconditionally respect parental figures. Regardless of specific behaviors, they demonstrate radically contradicting values they supposedly publicly represent, while secretly operating through manipulative patterns, exploiting vulnerabilities of dependents who blindly trust family authorities, erroneously presuming biology naturally guarantees protection and care, when reality regularly demonstrates that some of the most severe abuses occur precisely within family contexts, where domestic isolation and expectations about family loyalty create perfect conditions that victims internalized as normal through prolonged psychological conditioning, destroying capacities to recognize healthy boundaries and especially to defend basic rights against violations executed by people occupying positions of authority or trust in family hierarchies structured through power dynamics determined by age. For perpetrators to operate with impunity during years or decades, exploiting victims who lack resources or awareness to recognize systematic exploitation occurring gradually through progressive normalization of dysfunctional dynamics that begin subtly but continuously intensify until reaching levels of flagrant abuse that external observers would immediately recognize as unacceptable. But economic resources, physical capacity, and especially by control over narratives defining shared realities within family systems, functioning essentially as miniature cults where charismatic leaders manipulate perceptions of subordinate members through information control, progressive social isolation, and especially through alternation between occasional positive reinforcements and unpredictable punishments, creating emotional dependence that makes escape psychologically impossible even when physical doors remain unlocked, because most effective prisons are those constructed internally through conditioning that convinces captives they deserve abusive treatment, or are incapable of surviving independently from abusers who simultaneously cause suffering and offer occasional relief, creating vicious cycles of trauma and attachment that therapists specializing in domestic abuse recognize as characteristic patterns requiring professional intervention to break through gradual development of critical consciousness about manipulative dynamics, and especially through construction of alternative support networks, offering external validation and material resources necessary for physical escape from toxic environments, perpetuating profound psychological damage through prolonged exposure to systematic abuse, disguised as tough love or necessary discipline, that traditional cultures still mistakenly celebrate as parental virtues, instead of recognizing as forms of psychological violence causing developmental traumas persisting throughout adult lives, through relationship difficulties, chronic anxiety, recurrent depression, and especially through self-sabotage patterns where victims unconsciously replicate abusive dynamics in subsequent relationships, because those dysfunctional patterns were internalized as normal templates of human intimacy during formative periods, when infant brains develop fundamental cognitive schemas about how relationships function based primarily on parental examples that permanently shape expectations about love, trust, reciprocity, and especially about basic right to establish boundaries and demand respect that people raised in abusive environments frequently completely lack, requiring years of intensive therapy to develop capacities to recognize inappropriate treatment and especially to believe they deserve healthy relationships characterized by mutual respect, honest communication, and especially by absence of manipulation or coercion that should be universally unacceptable, but that patriarchal and ableist societies routinely normalize through multiple ideological mechanisms justifying power hierarchies that systematically benefit dominant groups at expense of marginalized populations, facing intersectional oppressions, multiplying vulnerabilities through complex interactions between different systems of domination operating simultaneously, to maintain privileges of powerful minorities, structurally dependent on exploitation of subordinated majorities, providing cheap labor, unpaid care, and especially ideological conformity, preventing collective questioning of foundations of profoundly unjust social order, perpetuating obscene inequalities across generations. The frustrated attempt to obtain emotional support from Claudia intensified the sensation of social isolation that discovery about Vera's betrayal had created, instantly transforming my understanding about recent family history, and especially about my position within family dynamics that apparently collectively saw me as a problem. Instead of recognizing I was a victim requiring protection and support, instead of criticism and blame that ableist narratives frequently impose on disabled people. Presuming difficulties faced are primarily resultant from negative personal attitudes, instead of systemic barriers created by structurally exclusionary society, treating accessibility as optional luxury instead of fundamental human right that should be universally guaranteed, regardless of costs. Because genuinely civilized societies committed to social justice recognize that value of human life cannot be reduced to economic calculations about individual productivity, but must be unconditionally affirmed as fundamental ethical principle, transcending utilitarian considerations about return on investment, measured through capitalist metrics, prioritizing capital accumulation above basic human well-being and especially above dignity that should be inviolable, regardless of specific functional capacities that ableist societies mistakenly employ as criteria determining who deserves full participation in community life, versus who must remain marginalized and especially invisibilized because presence of bodies deviating from norms about ideal functionality makes temporarily able-bodied people feel uncomfortable about universal fragility of human corporeality that everyone will eventually experience through aging or through accidents and diseases that suddenly transform productive people into dependent populations requiring care that neoliberal society treats as unsustainable burdens, instead of recognizing as fundamental collective responsibilities that decent human communities should voluntarily embrace as expressions of basic solidarity, transcending selfish calculations about immediate reciprocity, because mutual support systems function effectively when everyone contributes according to present capacities, knowing everyone will eventually need assistance during periods of vulnerability, inevitably characterizing trajectories of human lives marked by variable dependencies throughout life cycles, including childhood requiring intensive care, possible periods of illnesses or acquired disabilities at any age, and especially old age bringing progressive functional decline that should be compassionately welcomed by societies, genuinely valuing all human life instead of discarding people no longer able to contribute productively according to narrow definitions of productivity that capitalist economies employ to justify marginalization of populations considered economically unproductive, including people with disabilities, elderly, chronically unemployed, and especially impoverished populations that unjust economic systems deliberately created through policies concentrating wealth while distributing poverty, guaranteeing perpetual availability of cheap labor force desperate to accept degrading labor conditions because alternative is literally starving to death in societies that gradually abolished social safety nets that could have offered basic dignity regardless of participation in formal labor, market systematically excluding people facing multiple barriers including physical disabilities, lack of formal education resulting from intergenerational poverty, unpaid care responsibilities consuming time that could be dedicated to formal employment, and especially structural discrimination based on race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or any other characteristics that hierarchically organized societies employ to justify systematic exclusion of specific groups that economic and political elites consider threats to privileges, fundamentally dependent on maintenance of profound inequalities that contemporary capitalism not only tolerates but actively cultivates through economic policies prioritizing aggregate growth over equitable resource distribution, and especially over well-being of vulnerable populations that neoliberal economists treat as costs to be minimized, instead of recognizing as human beings deserving dignity, and especially genuine opportunities for full social participation that would require profound structural transformations, transcending superficial reforms that elites periodically concede to pacify social movements threatening stability of established order, but never challenge foundations of economic systems based on systematic exploitation of labor, and especially extraction of natural resources that capitalism treats as infinite, ignoring planetary limits. that climate science unequivocally demonstrates are being rapidly exceeded through unsustainable consumption of finite resources that growth-based economies structurally require. But that biophysical reality of planet with limited regeneration capacities makes absolutely impossible in long-term, creating fundamental contradiction between economic imperative of continuous expansion versus ecological necessity of stabilization or reduction of material throughput that human systems continuously extract from biosphere already dramatically degraded through centuries of industrialization that transformed human relationships with nature from predominantly cooperative, based on recognition of fundamental interdependence between human well-being and ecosystem health, to fundamentally extractive relationships treating nature as mere repository of resources to be unlimitedly exploited for capital accumulation, exclusively benefiting privileged minorities. While externalizing environmental and social costs onto marginalized populations, predominantly living in polluted areas near toxic industrial facilities or vulnerable regions, to intensified climate impacts that anthropogenic climate change is causing through extreme weather events, destroying essential infrastructure and especially livelihoods of impoverished populations who contributed minimally to historical emissions causing global warming, but disproportionately suffer consequences of decisions global northern elites made prioritizing immediate enrichment over long-term sustainability, and especially over intergenerational justice that would require preservation of habitable planetary conditions for future generations instead of selfishly exhausting finite resources, leaving devastating environmental liabilities that will persist for millennia, thus creating ecological debts present generations criminally impose on future descendants who never consented to systematic destruction of planetary life support systems through economic activities. Contemporary generations know perfectly well are unsustainable, but continue executing because short-term interests of economic elites completely dominate decision-making processes in democracies captured by corporations, employing massive lobbying and especially political contributions, effectively purchasing governments, transforming nominal democracies into functional oligarchies where popular will is systematically ignored whenever conflicting with interests of propertied classes, controlling economic resources sufficient to manipulate political processes, guaranteeing legislation and public policies primarily serve capital accumulation instead of collective well-being or ecological sustainability that would require systemic transformations. Elites violently resist because threatening privileges dependent on maintenance of profoundly unjust and especially unsustainable status quo in long term, but continuing to be ferociously defended through multiple coercion mechanisms, including police violence directed against social movements, questioning legitimacy of established order, and especially through control over educational systems and corporate media systematically indoctrinating populations, teaching ideological conformity, and especially cultivating individualism, preventing collective organization, necessary for effective resistance against domination structures, operating simultaneously through multiple dimensions of intersectional oppression that this specific case of family abuse vividly illustrates through convergence of ableism, economic exploitation of vulnerable person, systematic psychological manipulation, and especially through violation of family trust that society erroneously presumes immune to domination dynamics characterizing public institutions, ignoring overwhelming evidence, demonstrating families can be particularly dangerous contexts precisely because domestic isolation and cultural expectations about family privacy create perfect conditions for abuse operating with impunity, far from public scrutiny that could intervene protecting vulnerable victims from perpetrators exploiting positions of authority or trust for personal enrichment or satisfaction of pathological, manipulated to serve selfish interests instead of being respected as autonomous subjects deserving unconditional dignity, and especially rights that should be inviolable, regardless of specific relationships with perpetrators, frequently employing emotional bonds or material dependencies as coercion tools preventing victims from escaping or reporting psychological needs for control over others that psychology recognizes as characteristics of narcissistic or sociopathic personalities, fundamentally lacking genuine empathy and especially capacities to recognize basic humanity of other people treated instrumentally as objects to be abuses through implicit or explicit threats about consequences of public revelation of behaviors perpetrators know are indefensible but continue calculatedly executing because correctly perceiving accountability probability is extremely low, considering systemic failures in institutions supposedly responsible for protecting vulnerable populations but chronically lacking adequate resources. appropriate training, and especially political will to effectively prioritize well-being of marginalized people over interests of dominant classes, that legal and police systems primarily exist to protect, according to critical analyses, convincingly demonstrating through historical and contemporary evidence about actual functioning of institutions. Official rhetoric characterizes as neutral and dedicated to justice, but concrete practices reveal as fundamentally biased, systematically favoring privileged, while criminalizing poor people, disabled people, racial minorities, immigrants, and especially any group's elites consider potential threats to stability of social hierarchies, disproportionately benefiting those already occupying advantaged positions in power structures that intersectional analyses reveal as simultaneously patriarchal, capitalist, racist, ableist, heteronormative, cisnormative, and colonial, operating through multiple mutually reinforcing domination mechanisms, creating extremely resilient oppression systems, effectively resisting reforms, because genuine transformation of any specific oppression dimension inevitably threatens other dimensions, thus creating solidarity between different elite factions, normally competing with each other but promptly uniting whenever marginalized populations organize collective resistances, challenging legitimacy of established order, demonstrating implicit recognition by dominant classes that privileges structurally depend on maintenance of multiple hierarchies. Simultaneously, and that collapse of any specific domination system could catalyze broader questioning of foundations of profoundly unjust society that elites ferociously defend through violence when necessary, because alternatives based on genuine equality and social justice would fundamentally threaten obscene wealth accumulation propertied classes, consider natural right despite completely depending on systematic exploitation of labor, and especially externalization of social and environmental costs onto vulnerable populations, disproportionately bearing negative consequences of economic decisions, primarily benefiting those already privileged, creating vicious cycles of growing inequality that economic research extensively documents, demonstrating clear trends of progressive wealth concentration that contemporary capitalism inevitably produces absent aggressive redistributive interventions that neoliberalism systematically demonizes through massive propaganda, characterizing progressive taxation and market regulation as attacks on individual freedom, when in reality are essential mechanisms for preventing complete oligarchization of nominally democratic societies already largely functioning as plutocracies where wealth fundamentally determines access to political power, educational opportunities, adequate healthcare, safe housing, nutritious food, and especially legal justice, theoretically should be blind but practically operates as two. This is a tiered system where the rich purchase impunity through expensive lawyers, while the poor are systematically criminalized and massively incarcerated for minor offenses. The middle class and elites routinely commit without consequences, because having resources to avoid contact with criminal justice system functioning primarily as social control mechanism over marginalized populations that contemporary capitalism renders economically superfluous through progressive automation. Automation eliminates jobs traditionally offering survival possibilities for workers without extensive formal education, but now facing permanent structural unemployment or chronic underemployment in gig economy, offering zero security and especially zero dignity, transforming work that should be source of personal fulfillment and economic stability into desperate struggle for precarious survival, characterizing existences of billions globally. Neoliberalism treats these people as losers deserving poverty because meritocratic ideology capitalism systematically teaches economic success, reflects individual virtues completely ignoring structural advantages, fundamentally determining life trajectories through birth in specific families, particular geographical localities, determined historical moments, and especially through bodily characteristics that ableist, racist, sexist societies treat as indicators of human value. These characteristics should be completely irrelevant in societies genuinely committed to equality and justice, but continue operating as fundamental stratification criteria, perpetuating hierarchies that should have been abolished long ago, but stubbornly persist because serving interests of dominant groups, ferociously resisting transformations, threatening privileges dependent on maintenance of profound inequalities, ideologically justified through narratives about individual merit. Natural differences, or economic inevitabilities, that critical analyses demonstrate being social constructions serving specific political functions of legitimating unjust order that should be rejected and radically transformed through collectively organized social movements demanding substantial redistribution of resources and especially power that elites will never voluntarily concede, thus requiring sustained massive mobilizations. History demonstrates these mobilizations are possible, but require overcoming fragmentations that dominant ideologies deliberately cultivate to prevent solidarity between different oppressed groups that could form powerful coalitions, effectively challenging domination structures if managing to recognize common interests in transforming systems, exploiting them simultaneously through specific but fundamentally related oppression mechanisms. Intersectional analyses reveal these mechanisms as interconnected dimensions of single domination matrix that this particular family abuse case concretely illustrates through convergence of ableism, treating disabled person as less deserving of autonomy and dignity, economic exploitation of vulnerable person through appropriation of resources legally destined to her, systematic psychological manipulation isolating victim from social supports. The case also demonstrates violation of family trust. Society erroneously presumes impossible because feminist ideologies romanticize family as sanctuary of unconditional love, when reality regularly demonstrates families can be extremely dangerous contexts, especially for vulnerable members depending on others for basic survival, thus creating opportunities for exploitation. Unscrupulous people systematically take advantage of demonstrating. Biology doesn't naturally guarantee ethical behavior. Ethical behavior must be consciously cultivated through moral education, emphasizing empathy, responsibility, reciprocity, and especially respect for autonomy and dignity of all individuals, regardless of specific characteristics or particular relationships, that should never justify instrumental treatment of people as means to others' selfish ends, because such instrumentalization fundamentally violates Kantian categorical imperative. Ethical philosophy recognizes this as basic moral principle. Any rational person should accept, but practice demonstrates being routinely violated by individuals, prioritizing own interests over others' well-being, especially when managing to do so with impunity far from public scrutiny that could impose reputational or legal costs sufficient to discourage exploitative behaviors. Society rhetorically condemns, but institutional systems regularly fail to effectively prevent or punish. This demonstrates fundamental hypocrisy of social order proclaiming values of justice, equality, compassion, but concrete structures systematically contradict through daily operation of institutions protecting privileged, while marginalizing vulnerable, thus creating dramatic gaps between professed ideals and lived realities that critical analyses pitilessly reveal, exposing fundamental contradictions. Status quo. Defenders prefer obscuring through massive propaganda. Repression of dissenting voices that could mobilize populations to demand transformations. Elites desperately resist, because correctly recognizing privileges depend on maintenance of injustices benefiting minorities, at expense of majorities deserving much better but remaining subordinated through multiple domination mechanisms that should be destroyed through collectively organized struggles. History demonstrates are possible when oppressed populations manage to overcome divisions. Dominant systems intentionally cultivate these divisions to prevent solidarity that could fundamentally threaten established order, exclusively benefiting those already occupying advantaged positions in hierarchies that should be completely abolished through revolutionary transformations, finally creating genuinely equitable societies where all people enjoy dignity and opportunities, regardless of birth circumstances or bodily characteristics. These characteristics shouldn't determine human value in civilizations truly deserving that name, but present world state unequivocally demonstrates humanity still has long road to travel before achieving social justice. That should be fundamental objective collectively guiding efforts of all genuinely caring about fellow beings' well-being, and especially about possibility of habitable future for coming generations deserving to inherit viable planet. Instead of ecological and social ruins present, trajectory will inevitably produce, unless radical transformations urgently occur, reorienting collective priorities from capital accumulation to sustainability and justice, that should always have been primary objectives, but were systematically subordinated to profit imperatives. Capitalism treats as sacred when should be recognized as profoundly problematic, requiring overcoming through construction of alternatives. These alternatives should be based on cooperation, reciprocity, mutual care, and especially recognition of fundamental interdependence connecting all human beings and also non-humans sharing fragile planet we must collectively protect to guarantee survival of all life forms, deserving respect far beyond what traditional anthropocentrism granted, limiting moral consideration only to humans, ignoring suffering of countless non-human animals. Capitalist production systems horribly exploit these animals, treating sentient beings as commodities that ethics should recognize as individuals deserving protection against unnecessary suffering. Industries systematically inflict to maximize profits, thus demonstrating dehumanization. Capitalism cultivates reducing everything, including life itself, to monetary value that can be unlimitedly exploited for accumulation, exclusively benefiting minorities. This causes incalculable suffering to human and non-human majorities deserving much better, thus demanding urgent transformations, unfortunately remaining unlikely. Considering entrenched power of elites controlling collective destinies through institutions they systematically captured, guaranteeing decisions primarily serve their interests, perpetuating indefinitely injustices that should profoundly shame anyone with functional moral conscience. But majority passively accepts through ideological conditioning, educational systems, and corporate media effectively execute cultivating conformity, and especially resignation, preventing collective action that alone could fundamentally transform realities. This specific case tragically illustrates through particular abuse story replicating generalized exploitation patterns, characterizing contemporary society operating through multiple scales. From interpersonal relations to global structures, but always fundamentally involving same domination principles, critical analyses reveal as central to functioning of systems we should collectively reject, but continue tolerating through inertia and especially through lack of political imagination. Neoliberalism, systematically cultivated through decades of propaganda, famously proclaiming there are no alternatives when obviously exist multiple possibilities. We should collectively explore these possibilities through democratic experimentation elites fear, because threatens control they currently exercise over decision, making processes that should be radically democratized, permitting genuine participation of all people affected by decisions instead of power concentration in hands of minorities claiming to know better. But track record clearly demonstrates being incompetent. Elites are especially uncommitted to collective well, being consistently prioritizing own narrow interests over majority's needs, deserving much better, but remaining subordinated through multiple mechanisms that should be destroyed through organized movements, unfortunately remaining fragmented and especially insufficiently radical to effectively challenge deep domination structures. This specific family abuse case concretely reveals. Operating through convergence of multiple oppression dimensions, Marina simultaneously experienced as woman, as person with disability, as person in poverty artificially created through systematic theft of resources that should have guaranteed basic dignity, and especially as daughter in culture teaching unquestioning obedience to parental figures, Vera cynically exploited to execute with impunity during 8 years criminal scheme finally discovered. The consequences will remain uncertain depending on how legal institutions respond, thus demonstrating whether systems allegedly dedicated to justice will function adequately, protecting vulnerable victim and holding perpetrator accountable, or will shamefully fail, as so often occurs when victims are marginalized, people without resources or connections. Legal systems typically systematically favor demonstrating justice is frequently commodity-rich purchase, while poor are regularly denied, revealing fundamental hypocrisy of order, proclaiming equality before law, but practices flagrantly contradict through daily operation of institutions that should serve justice, but frequently perpetuate injustices. This particular case will test revealing whether Marina will finally receive deserved reparation or will be re-victimized through systems that should protect her, but could tragically fail as frequently happens. Vulnerable people navigating bureaucratic labyrinths apparently designed to discourage access to theoretical rights through creation of practical obstacles. Only people with substantial resources manage to overcome. Demonstrating formal rights are frequently empty for marginalized populations lacking material means to effectively access them, thus revealing urgent need for transformations, guaranteeing substantive justice instead of merely formal. Present order inadequately offers this, leaving countless vulnerable people unprotected against exploitation. This case vividly illustrates through Marina's particular story, tragically representing experiences of millions suffering similarly, but remaining invisible because society prefers ignoring disturbing realities, revealing fundamental contradictions between proclaimed values and concrete practices that should profoundly shame civilization claiming to be advanced, but continuing tolerating injustices that should be unacceptable to anyone with basic moral conscience, but majority passively accepts through combination of intentionally cultivated ignorance and especially resignation-dominant ideologies, systematically promote to prevent resistances that could fundamentally transform realities. Millions face daily surviving precarities. Current systems inevitably produce, but alternatives could overcome. If managing to collectively mobilize political will necessary for transformations remaining possible but unlikely, considering entrenched power of elites, ferociously resisting changes threatening privileges dependent on status quo maintenance, Marina courageously challenged through decision to report suffered abuse, despite substantial risks of family retaliation and especially institutional failure that could leave her even worse than before. Thus, demonstrating extraordinary courage abuse victims frequently demonstrate when finally deciding to resist against oppressors, despite potential costs that can be devastating, but accept because alternative of continuing tolerating exploitation eventually becomes unsustainable when consciousness about suffered injustice reaches levels making conformity impossible, thus motivating action. This account inspiringly documents. Offering example, other people facing similar situations could follow recognizing resistance is possible, and especially victims aren't alone, but are part of vast populations, experiencing oppressions that are systemic instead of merely individual, thus requiring collectively organized responses. Social movements could provide if managing to mobilize solidarity, transcending fragmentations, currently preventing formation of broad coalitions. Necessary for profound structural transformations, genuine justice requires but remaining elusive, demonstrating limits of reforms within fundamentally problematic systems that should be completely replaced through construction of radically different alternatives based on principles of substantive equality, genuine solidarity, ecological sustainability, and especially recognition of unconditional dignity of all people, regardless of specific characteristics or circumstances that should never determine human value in societies deserving to be called civilized, but present state unequivocally demonstrates we're still far from achieving that ideal, thus requiring continuation of struggles past generations initiated and present generations must continue hoping future generations will finally achieve justice remaining distant objective. But we must persistently pursue. Because alternative of resignation would be unacceptable betrayal of all who suffered and continue suffering under weight of oppressive systems. This particular Marina story tragically, but also inspiringly, illustrates through her courageous decision to finally resist against injustices she tolerated during years before reaching breaking point. Motivating action, this account documents offering valuable testimony about realities society prefers ignoring, but we must honestly confront if genuinely aspiring to create more just world for all people, especially most vulnerable deserving protection instead of exploitation. Current systems routinely permit through institutional failures that should be urgently corrected but remain unsolved due to lack of political will. Only sustained popular pressure could create forcing elites to concede reforms they'd never voluntarily offer, thus demonstrating necessity of collective organization this case could inspire if Marina's story reached broad audiences mobilizing empathy that could motivate solidarity and especially transformative political action. Genuine justice absolutely requires. Did you enjoy Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.